에스프레소를 처음 추출하다 보면 이렇게 채널링이 생긴 맛없는 에스프레소 추출한 적 없으신가요? 이걸 직접 맛보면 뭔가 좀 씁쓸하면서 맹맹하기도 하고 어떤 건 신맛이 굉장히 강하게 나는데요. 정말 안타까운 게 이렇게 맛없는 에스프레소를 마시고 자기랑 안 맞다고 싫어하시는 분들이 많더라고요. 그래서 오늘 영상은 200만 커피 유튜버 제임스 호프만이 알려주는 에스프레소 맛있게 추출하는 방법에 대해서 영상 준비해봤습니다. 그렇다면 바로 영상 시작하겠습니다. 좋아요와 구독, 알림 설정 부탁드리겠습니다.
Today we're going to talk about espresso puck prep. We're going to go through the techniques and the tools involved in getting your ground coffee ready for optimal brewing inside an espresso machine. Now the goal of espresso puck prep is basically to get that little puck of coffee ready so that when the water flows through it, it flows through as evenly as possible. That's it. That's the goal. We want it to flow through at a certain kind of time. We want to control how much liquid goes through it, but those are kind of outside of the prep piece of this thing. So first step is kind of going to be bean prep. And I'm going to recommend for many people, especially when they're starting and getting to know their grinder, weighing both the input and output from the grinder. So you're going to weigh your coffee beans, and then you're going to weigh the grounds once they're in the portafilter as well. Not every grinder is a zero retention grinder or a low retention grinder. So you want to make sure that you're getting out what you're putting in. So for me here, I'm going to dose 18.5 grams in, and I'm going to grind it, and then I'll weigh it in the portafilter to see how we've done. Now this is maybe tangential to puck prep, but it's kind of part of the whole routine. I'm going to use what's called the Ross droplet technique. You're going to get a little spray bottle and just spray a single spray over those coffee beans. If you're doing this once or twice a day, I think it's fine to spray every single dose. If you're making a lot of espresso, you'll find that your weighing vessel gets a little damp and you don't need to spray. If your manufacturer of your grinder recommends you don't do this, then maybe just use this sort of teaspoon method, but for most grinders, a little spray of water on the beans does absolutely no damage. It reduces static and reduces retention, and that makes it a good thing. Last little thing is before I dose coffee into my portafilter, I'm going to make sure my basket is completely dry. I like to use a little bit of toweling for that. Nice and dry and clean. Dosing into a wet basket can sort of encourage water to flow where water's already been, and you get a kind of additional flow around the edges of the puck rather than through it, or so goes the theory. So next up is an interesting one, and I would say it's the thing that was the biggest surprise in testing. Was definitely something that kind of caught me by surprise a little bit, despite the fact that I've been aware of this now for a good long while, and that is using a little bit of paper at the bottom of your espresso basket. In testing, it caused the flow of the espresso to increase quite dramatically. Shots that were pulling at say 28, 29 seconds were suddenly pulling at 23 seconds. And in doing so, it also increased their extraction quite notably. The frustrating thing is that it's actually quite hard to get a food-safe bit of paper that fits the bottom of the basket. Some people have been using scientific papers. They are not rated as kind of food-safe. I don't think there's a huge risk there, but you should be aware of the risks of kind of non-food safe papers. Anyway, to grind. So on the scale, we've got 18.5 grams out. That's kind of what we wanted. And so we can move into the next phase, which is ultimately the most important phase of puck prep, and that is distribution. Things are going to get a bit more opinionated here. But first, I'm going to talk about one more tool, which is a dosing funnel. They look like this, and they sit on top of your portafilter. This one I particularly like because it has magnets, so it sticks really nicely on there. It's just a little bit more reassuring, but it's not by any stretch essential. This is useful in the next phase with different kinds of distribution because it will prevent spillage and mess. Because if we take it off and look at the basket right now, we've got this mound of coffee in the middle, and around the edges, we've got some coffee sort of gaps or troughs, so to speak. If I just compress this now with my tamper, I will not have an even bed of coffee. The thinner parts of the bed will be much easier for water to get through, and so more water will flow through less coffee. And that won't taste great. So what we need to do is distribute the coffee evenly around the basket. There's a number of ways to do that. Additionally, you'll see that there's kind of clumps here, where as part of the grinding process, the grounds have almost been slightly squeezed together, and they will stay as clumps after they've been tamped, and there'll be a more dense pocket of coffee compared to the pocket around them. Again, they promote uneven extraction. We want to get rid of the clumps. What we're going to do is get our needles in there and start deep, start right at the bottom of the basket, and essentially stir and move around the coffee inside. We're looking to make sure that the coffee is evenly distributed from the base. Any clumps in the bottom section are broken up, then work up a little bit higher until you're just sort of dealing with the top section, and you should have, afterwards, a very nice, even looking bed of coffee. This for me is sort of prepped and ready to tamp and move on with. Now I would recommend it, I like it, but there are other ways to distribute coffee before tamping, and so let's talk about the next one, which is wedge distributors. There's also something like this from Pullman, which again works in a similar kind of way. And the idea is that this thing is going to go and do kind of two jobs. As you move it around, it's going to smooth the coffee around inside the basket to help distribute it. It's also, in that process, going to apply some pressure to the point that some people recommend just distributing and not tamping. So it goes in, and you rotate, and you smooth it around, and you end up with what looks very nice. It looks very even, it's quite satisfying, it feels like it's well tamped. You've done a good job, so to speak. All of this leads us to the last stage of espresso puck prep, which is tamping. Now, obviously you'll tamp and then put on, say, a puck screen if you're going to do that, but I figured this was kind of a nice last step to talk about. If you want to use a traditional tamper, then the ergonomics are important in terms of looking after your body. You want to hold it kind of like a doorknob, thumb pointing down the whole tamper, and when you tamp, you want to have your elbow right above the coffee, as if you're about to sort of screw in a screw that might be sticking out of the wood surface. You've got a screwdriver in your hand, you would get right over it so you could drive down and apply pressure. Now here, you don't need to twist. You're just looking to press down as evenly as possible until the coffee stops feeling squishy. That's it. You're trying to press as much air out of the coffee as you can to make sure that the bed is even, there's no air pockets left behind. I like to rotate the tamper very slightly so that with my fingertips I can feel if I'm level or not. If I'm not level, I'll feel it as my fingers rotate. Twisting, polishing, that kind of stuff, I learned to do it and no one knows why. We did it. We've mostly stopped doing it. It feels nice, feels a little bit flashy, does nothing for your coffee, so don't worry about it. That's a traditional tamp. On the tamping front, there are obviously other options. You can use a wedge distributor. You do have things like this, which is the force tamper, which is a very expensive solution to a problem. Something like this will sort of stop pressing at a certain pressure. You'll hear a kind of click, like that, where you've crossed a threshold of pressure. You've definitely pressed hard enough, and it won't press any harder. Additionally, the sort of design of this means that it sits on the rim of the basket. It should tamp perfectly level every time. Now, as you can see, it has no negative impact on crema. There's plenty of the good foamy stuff on top if that's what you like. That's a tasty, clean, balanced espresso.
어떠신가요? 생각보다 간단하면서 준비 과정이 굉장히 복잡하다고 느껴지시나요? 저도 처음에 에스프레소 추출할 때 몇 가지 루틴이 너무 귀찮아서 스킵하고 추출해봤는데 바로 채널링이 생기고 맛없는 에스프레소가 추출돼서 다 못 마시고 버렸던 경험이 있습니다. 제임스 호프만이 알려주는 에스프레소 추출 방식을 따라해보시면 아마 맛있는 에스프레소를 추출하실 수 있을 겁니다. 마지막으로 오늘 영상 한번 정리해보겠습니다. 맛있는 에스프레소를 추출하기 위해서는 첫 번째, 원두를 18.5g을 넣고 정전기 방지를 위해 원두에 물을 뿌려주고 섞어줍니다. 두 번째, 포터필터는 항상 마른 상태를 유지해주고 젖어있다면 마른 수건으로 닦아줍니다. 세 번째, 원두를 분쇄해서 받아주고 뭉쳐있는 커피를 침칠봉으로 풀어줍니다. 네 번째, 레벨링 툴로 포터필터에 있는 커피를 평평하게 만들어줍니다. 마지막으로 평평하게 정리된 커피를 탬핑 후 추출해 주시면 됩니다. 오늘 준비한 영상은 여기까지입니다. 다음에도 더 좋은 커피 영상으로 찾아오겠습니다. 감사합니다.